So there's been 3 days now of unrest in Ballymena in Northern Ireland, triggered seemingly by an alleged sexual assault. Sparked a huge anti-migrant backlash. Many people of foreign birth have been targeted. Cars have been set on fire. People's houses vandalised. Tom, what have you made of this unrest? I mean, this is not the first anti-migration riot on the island of Ireland,
Hmm.
and not even in the United Kingdom in recent years.
No, absolutely. And it's one of those things where, first and foremost, there is the horrific scenes that we've seen on the streets themselves. As you say, the rioting, the burning down of homes, leisure centres, throwing masonry, burning barricades, and so on. Something that's kind of spilled over from an original kind of peaceful protest, which gets hijacked by people
Mm.
who want to cause trouble. Horrific scenes of people being kind of targeted, burnt out of their houses, even though they had absolutely nothing to do with the horrendous crime that actually sparked this. You know, even the heartbreaking images of the sort of local Filipino community putting signs up in their windows saying Filipinos live here, to try and move the mob over from their particular street. As you say, was also sparked by a horrific alleged crime that we should also note and talk about. There's not a hell of a lot that we can say,
Mm.
but nevertheless, two 14-year-old boys, seemingly of Romanian Roma background, who all we know so far about them is that they're alleged to have committed this very serious sexual assault against a teenage girl, and that they have entered their pleas via a Romanian interpreter. And it's one of those things where at moments like this, because there has been a repeated pattern, which I'm sure we'll get into, clearly kind of condemning the violence and the racism where it has been expressed is obviously morally essential, but also kind of insufficient
Yeah.
because of the fact that we have seen, whilst the nature of County Antrim has its own kind of particularity, shall we say, this is also a story that we've seen repeat itself, not just across the island of Ireland, but the UK. You think about the Knowsley riots outside that migrant hotel back in 2023, where you had a very similar situation, a quite impoverished community that had experienced a lot of inward migration, in that case, bearing the brunt of a lot of the asylum claims in that particular hotel. You have an alleged crime, in that case, a alleged on-street grooming of a young girl, which becomes the spark for a protest, which then gets hijacked and so on. Of course, we saw it in Dublin in 2023 as well. We saw it across the country last summer, and they're just the conversation cannot begin and end with condemning the horrendous behaviour that we've seen. You need to look at more broadly what has taken place, and it does feel like across the country, particularly in deindustrialised places which have seen huge amounts of inward migration, not much attention paid to integration. It seems like you kind of, in so many places, the failure of policy has created, if you wanted to create the kind of the atmosphere in which resentments could get out of hand, or that problems could arise like this, that you could have really horrific clashes, these are the kinds of policy failures that you would preside over. So I think we just need to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time where these things are
Yeah.
concerned. And yet it seems where the politicians are speaking about this, it begins and ends with just condemning the violence. That's clearly not enough. We want to get to the roots of what's been actually going on here.
And Paul, it often seems when there's an incident like the one we're talking about that sparks these kinds of events, there is always a tendency on the part of the establishment to downplay that there are any problems. And actually, it's all, people are only ever racist. It stems from their own bigotry. There are no issues to be dealt with. Obviously, as Tom says, we condemn utterly the violence, especially racist violence. But people can't even, it's as if to say these people are, ignored is a bit of an understatement in a way.
Yeah, and some of the scenes have been genuinely harrowing. Seeing
Mm.
people set light to the property of people who are almost certainly entirely innocent, and doing so because they think those people have come from a particular community and therefore a fair game to be targeted. You can't condemn that strongly enough.
Yeah.
And frankly, some of the louts who have been responsible for that deserve to go to jail for a very long time, in my opinion. Behind that, and it's a little bit similar, I think, to Southport as well, that, on the front line were some undesirable people who deserve to go to jail, no question. But behind that, there's also a large body of people who may not have been committing the violence, but are just maybe standing there to protest, to make their feelings known. Who are expressing, what is, I think, a growing resentment in Ballymena and post Southport and elsewhere in our country. Some of those tensions are real. Some of those tensions are genuine, and the people who are voicing their unease about what's going on in our country and are not turning to violence do deserve to be listened to. And I think that by and large, these are people who have, for a number of years now, have been crying out about the impact of globalization in their communities, the impact of deindustrialization, as Tom said, in their communities, particularly the impacts of mass immigration in their communities, the promotion by successive governments of state-sponsored multiculturalism, a hard multiculturalism, which I think has divided and fragmented communities. What people, I think, see as an asymmetrical multiculturalism, as some people have started calling it, where they think constantly, we have to be inclusive and welcoming and celebrate other people's cultures, but any expression of, the indigenous culture, if you like, is supposed to be downplayed and suppressed because, that's something that we shouldn't encourage. And people are not stupid. People sense that is what's happening. They sense that it's not happening just in their own communities. They sense that it's happening elsewhere around Britain. And people have time and again voted to challenge, to push back against this. Did it with Brexit. They did it in the 2019 general election, where they've said time and again, enough is enough. We need a change to the approach, particularly the sort of loose immigration policy, which is having such an impact. And time and again, they've been ignored. And I always say that, the ballot box is a safety valve. And if people feel that they cannot get change through the ballot box, and they must be coming to that view now in some of these communities, and they're justified probably in coming to that view, then don't be surprised if they take to the streets and say, we're now going to have to try unconventional methods because you lot in power are not listening to us. Notwithstanding all of that, we need to condemn some of what has gone on 100%.
Definitely. And Tom, one of the other safety valves is free speech. Again, this is a subject that it's risky to talk about, let alone protest about.
No, absolutely. And it's one of those things where whether it's the clamp down on people talking about these issues or whether it's actually the amount of information that is allowed to eke out, you see a similar caginess on the part of the authorities as well as the media. I mean, if you were looking at the BBC, you would often have to click through quite a few number of articles and kind of read between the lines to work out what the crime, the alleged crime, we should say, that sparked all of this was, what the profile of the alleged perpetrators were, the fact that the BBC News story that actually referenced the fact that they've been brought in and entered their pleas, even quite euphemistically just referred to them as they entered they gave them their names and their details through a Romanian interpreter. So again, even there's a kind of nervousness. And I think this is a real problem. It's something that we've seen repeated time and time again, which is because the state and because the media essentially think that the more information you give to people, the more likely they are to fly off the handle. You create these information vacuums which get filled sometimes by people who are genuinely trying to push things in a more explicitly racist, anti-migrant, violent direction. You saw that after Southport, obviously. You saw that in the wake of what happened here. You saw that in Dublin as well, where there's going to be the more it creates precisely the opposite of what the authorities and the powers that be want to bring about. It actually inflames things. It allows the conversation to be hijacked. And that's actually also kind of broader stories, what's happened with the immigration discussion more generally. The fact that to the extent that the mainstream did touch it, it was in a very kind of cursory way, and no one really believed that the political parties were actually that bothered by it or that affected by it. You create a situation in which to have some of these difficult conversations, people found themselves gravitating towards sections of the online right where you actually could talk about this issue, and it was actually being talked about in a way that was purposely inflammatory and with its own set of bigoted agendas attached to it. So as ever, like the answer to all of this is more open discussion, taking people's views more seriously, allowing that safety valve of democracy or free speech or whatever. But we're lumbered with politicians who actually think that's the most dangerous thing you could possibly do.
And similar to the elite's resistance to the idea that that there should be the release of information regarding crimes by foreign nationals in which particular country they come from. And there was huge resistance to that. And you saw when Yvette Cooper, I think it was, eventually said, yes, we will provide this information. You saw all of these kind of liberal voices on social media saying how terrible it was that this information is being provided to the public. And it's rank hypocrisy, actually, because these are the same people who will when it comes to, for example, foreign nationals working in the National Health Service, people who have come here from abroad to work in the National Health Service, and we're constantly told, we should celebrate this, and we see the charts, don't we, with all the flags. This is where all the workforce come from. And you think, okay, yeah, fair enough. I mean, we do need a debate about whether it's right to strip those countries of their important medical resources, doctors and nurses and so on. But they're quite happy to give us that information. But when it comes to something like crime, when we ask for the same thing, okay, well now tell us the makeup of this, tell us where people are coming from. They say there's absolutely no reason for you to have that information. And the problem is that's when the conspiracy theories then start. That's when people say, well, if we can't rely on the mainstream media to provide this information, if they go to such lengths to stop us knowing, about the suspects in the Ballymena case, then actually, why should we believe them on anything? So in many respects, I think those people at the top, the elites, are making a rod for their own backs on this stuff.
And it's feeding that which you're starting to see creeping around the edges, a very kind of explicit sort of white victimhood, sort of far-right politics, which is being curdled. And it's very much in response to this idea. It was like, oh, when it's a white guy who commits a crime, you're going to tell him, what his background was. But when it's someone from a different background, because you don't trust us, you're going to go down this route. Again, it's like everything they do to try and assuage what this is, the situation, to try and calm things down. They only end up inflaming things or handing a boost and a fillip to the people who you really don't want to be handing that boost or that fillip to. So, but they just keep doing this time and time again, because ultimately they don't trust the public. They think that a riot is what happens when you allow people to speak their minds too
much.
And
they think people are stupid. They think people are not going to realise this is what you're doing to us. You're clearly, we're reading these stories and you're clearly withholding this information as if people are not going to suss that out and perhaps respond to it in the way that they do sometimes.
Or even that people aren't capable of having a balanced debate, that we're able to say that, most migrants contribute and then some people are criminals. And that doesn't mean that that doesn't necessarily mean you'd go down a racist path, to just have the knowledge of what's going on.